Welcome to the Art Against Mental Illness podcast. My name is Alex Lovelace and this is my podcast about the healing powers of art for artists, art lovers, the art curious and anyone with an interest in mental health and well-being. Hello and welcome back and a happy new year. I hope you had a good holiday / Christmas / New Year period. I recognise that this period is quite hard for many people, especially my neurodivergent friends, and hope the last couple of weeks gave you peace and a bit of respite from the onslaught of the holiday period. And I hope that getting back into normal life isn't too jarring for everybody. This year is looking like it's going to be anything but boring for all of us, so be safe and be nice to each other. This is part 2 of my 2024 first 6 months, 496 minutes, 8.3 hours and 25 episode retrospective of Art Against Mental Illness. This is coming a bit later than I intended, partly because I discovered that no one really listens to podcasts over Christmas, so there wasn't really much point in publishing anything, and partly because I was enjoying myself too much in the studio and thus was sort of avoiding this. It's currently minus temperatures outside and my studio is almost unbearably cold, and I have to wrap up like an Arctic explorer to spend any time out there. So I'm in the cosy confines of my office recording this for you people. So without any further ado, I'm just going to get back into my per episode recap. And this starts with episode 10, released July the 21st, 2024, called Suffering for Art. This was quite a dark one. I can't really remember exactly what triggered my decision to do an episode on this. I was listening to a series of podcasts that there was a retrospective on the early 90s Seattle music scene, the whole grunge scene, and I think anyone who's even vaguely aware of that period will know we lost quite a few incredible artists such as Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, Mark Lanigan and latterly Chris Cornell to various self-inflicted tragedies. And I think that led me to sort of reflect on the nature of art as a conversation with an artist and their fans, and that these people died because they were suffering in their lives because of their fame, because of their lifestyles, because of very many complex reasons that led to extremely poor mental health, and that they used their art as an outlet. And I think that there's a sort of dangerous perspective that an artist must suffer to make good art, which I think is incredibly wrong. All artists use art as a way to relieve suffering, and they suffered despite their art, not because of it. And I think this is a really important point to remember. I think it's contingent to us as art fans to support the people that we revere rather than to constantly pressure and badger them. There's been a particular problem over the past year with various artists in the spotlight. The one that springs to mind is Chapel Roan, who are really suffering because of what's called toxic fanhood, where your very own fans are hounding you to the ends of the earth and watching everything that you do, and it can become quite unpleasant. And I think Kurt Cobain particularly had an issue with this. I think we need to give our heroes a bit of space and a bit of a break, and don't expect them to constantly feed our need for catharsis with their misery. If you love someone, just let them be who they need to be and give them space. I do remember I actually wrote this episode on while I was on a train going to and from a coastal town in Scotland, where me and my family went, and we found a beach, and I went swimming in the sea in Scotland, which I'm sure you'll agree is quite brave of me. And I encountered a seal who was just bobbing around in the water watching me, and there were dolphins cavorting about a mile away, and it was absolutely incredible experience. So I had a bit of a jarring juxtaposition in here as I was experiencing something quite life-affirming, and while considering a bunch of people who had lost theirs through mental illness. So it was all quite poignant to me. So this episode is quite a personal episode and something that I really, really feel very strongly about. Cobain, Cornell, Plath, Van Gogh, Whitehouse and countless others, none of them owed me, you or anyone else their pain, and certainly not their lives. For you and I to experience their pain, for it to feel authentic, these artists must have experienced that pain. But let us be specific here. Depression can be fatal. It kills via suicide. Shunning or criticising an artist for seeming more cheerful or positive or, dare I say it, happy is, in a sense, equivalent to expecting a cancer sufferer to dial back their treatment so that you can continue to empathise in their struggle. We don't need artists to suffer to gratify our need for catharsis. Suffering happens, that's a fact of life, but it is never necessary, never. It is always wrong to wish or otherwise expect someone else to experience pain for our own gratification. These people were not martyrs to their art or their fans. They were humans experiencing intolerable levels of illness and misery. They used art, creativity, performance as a release and a relief. And we should be thankful and feel blessed that they did. But they didn't suffer because of their art, they suffered despite their art. On to the next one. This was July the 31st, 2024, called for Therapeutic Outlet Transitions. So this was another one of my therapeutic outlet sessions where I basically just get in front of a microphone and ramble about something. This was happening while I was in the process of moving house, which I really didn't want to do. Moving to a new studio, uprooting my life and moving to a situation I was not at all happy with, but had come about via necessity. It turned out that move probably wasn't so wise after all. And so I took the hit on this while not actually removing the problem that it was supposed to remove. So it's all been a bit complicated and unpleasant. So I ramble on here about how transitions for most of us are inherently traumatic. I think a lot of people, when going through some sort of transition or difficult period, will drop their creative endeavours as something that is perhaps a luxury of time and space and effort that can't be afforded, because you need all your mental energy and time to deal with whatever you're dealing with, the transition that you're experiencing. And I argue that this is the wrong way to think about this. And if you rely on art as a therapeutic outlet like I do, then you need to make room in whatever way you can to spend time doing your creative practices, despite the fact that you might find that difficult to do, because this is such an important part of who you are and how you maintain your mental health. And I think the time you need it most is when life is at its most challenging. So don't consider this time that you spend doing this as a luxury. I think you should consider it as essential. And I recognise it's not always possible to do this, but wherever it is, don't drop your creative activities because you think they're a luxury. Keep them going, because they are definitely not. If, like me, you're going through a transition, you have my sympathy. And if, like me, you're the type of person that finds these things very difficult, you need to make sure that you look after yourself. You need to make sure that you have your space to escape and to recenter. There is never a more important time to find those spaces than in times like this. Thursday, August the 8th, 2024, How to Be Creative Part 1, all that jazz. Now, I promised to continue this series at some point. I got to Part 2, which we'll cover in a little bit. But I put quite a lot of effort into these. I feel like I want to do this subject justice, and therefore I do quite a lot of research, and I try and bring quite a lot of subject areas and inspiration, and so they take me a long time to write. And trying to write episode 2 of this series was for me very difficult, and saw very many false starts. But the first episode sort of came tumbling out of me off the back of a bit of a deep dive into this, and I really enjoyed writing it. And I talk about the rudiments of creativity and introduce the concept that I come back to over and over again, which is the need to introduce a bit of chaos into your artistic practice. I talk about John Coltrane a lot and his approach to creativity and various other artists as well. And I think this is a really good episode. I'm really pleased with it. So with my original list, mastery, conviction, an open mind, collaboration and focus, you have a set of ingredients that can be put together in varying measures to cook up something different. But to really mix things up, you need a sprinkling of chaos. It's like making your omelette with all the usual stuff, then picking up something random from the fridge or pantry to add in every time you make it to see what works. Sure, some omelettes will end up being choked down or just thrown in the bin, but once in a while you'll create something magical. So chaos isn't one of the core ingredients, it's more like a method or seasoning. It can be applied to any or all of the ingredients at any point in the process, in any amount. It could be argued that, as far as creativity is concerned, it is the magic unicorn juice. Episode 13, Fighting Back. Sunday, September the 8th. There was a month between these two episodes, and that was not my intention. This is probably where my challenges of 2024 hit their nadir or their apex, depending on which way you want to look at it. And I simply was not functioning on any meaningful level. And I felt like I needed to do my How to Be Creative Part 2, and I couldn't get it out. And I couldn't really find any mental energy to do the things that I needed to do to get another episode out. I didn't think anyone cared or was listening. I thought it was all pointless. I really had a crisis of everything. I'd spent a bunch of time preparing for a solo exhibition that went well, but not many people turned up. And I've been using the preparation and the energy and the momentum for that to prop up my sort of self-esteem. And that all came crashing down when the exhibition was over, and I found myself in a very dark place indeed. And it took me a few weeks to recalibrate and figure out what was going on and what I needed to do to make myself better. And that's when this episode came out. I chose to record a very frank episode about what had been happening to me and how I was at that point, and how my mental health was at that point, and to make a resolution, a commitment to get better and to dig myself out of this hole. And I remember at this point I was still very, very low, and where I am now versus that is quite stark. I'm in a much better mental space. But what's important to note is that my life situation, the problems that I had back then, have not gone away. It's arguable they've got worse. But I feel way more optimistic, way more energetic, way more enthusiastic, and way more creative. I'm being ridiculously creative at the moment. And that gives me hope that I can find solutions to my problems and to really, as this episode says, fight back, to really recover and to make something of the next year and the coming years, despite all the horrors that are going on in the world. And my resolution is to help people, is to do something for the community and do something for other people, to help anyone who has struggled like I have to lead a better life, to conquer their mental illness and to find solace, beauty and comfort in creativity. And I hope I'm achieving that in some small way, but I'm not done by a very long shot. And I'm going to make this bigger and better over the coming year. And I hope you'll join me for it. I think I'll look back on this episode from time to time in the future and use it to remind myself of how bad things can get and how recovery is possible. And as much as this podcast is to a degree a sort of a diary or a memoir of my life and the things that I'm thinking, this is going to be one of the most important chapters. So this is my fight back. I choose to recognise distress itself as my enemy and to face it down. To do this, I need to accept the fact, while recognising my situation on its face values, it is what it is, nothing more, nothing less. Then I need to do the things that I need to do to show my brain what I expect of it. I will keep taking on reality one day at a time. I will keep fighting. I will get better, and I acknowledge that there will be peaks and troughs, but I choose to keep fighting. So, episode 14, October the 15th, 2024. I was still putting things out pretty slow. That was, 3 weeks later, something like that. This one's called Overthinking. And I think this was me finally breaking my writer's block in terms of creating content for this podcast, and I think probably in general as well. One of the things that comes with depression and anxiety is a tendency to overthink everything and to overanalyze and to find reasons to not do things, to find reasons to be pessimistic. And it's not a choice as such. It's just something that our brains are doing because of the poor state that they're in. And so I wrote an episode on overthinking to try and get me out of overthinking. And I think it's a really, really important part of the artistic process, and it manifests itself in all sorts of ways. For example, writer's block, or not being able to continue a podcast. And this really was the point where I started again. I almost start to think of it as season 2 of this podcast, although that's not how I divide things up. That's ultimately what it became. And it's a good episode, and it feels really fresh for me. And it does feel like a bit like a new start. And again, I think I'll look back on this one as quite a positive thing. Let me be explicit about this. Overthinking is a poison to spontaneity. And art, regardless how you approach it, is underpinned by spontaneity. The strokes or the marks you put down on a canvas or paper, the notes you lay down on a piano, there's always a level of spontaneity that happens to create the thing in front of you. You are not a machine, you're a sentient being, and therefore the job of creation is a process, and it's necessarily spontaneous. Episode 15, October the 24th, 2024, Finding Your Voice. What's interesting to me is how little I understand my own artistic voice. For me, it feels like I'm very haphazard, stylistically speaking, and that I'm always trying different things. I'm always throwing everything I can at whatever I'm doing, and anything that comes to my mind or anything that's available around me sort of just gets stuffed in. It's a bit of a kitchen sink approach. And sometimes I look across my recent body of work and think, you could take chunks out of this and think this is not the same person that made this, when it is. And I think that's wrong. And I've been told many times by people that, no, you can't see the thread that runs through this, but we all can. And that people see that it ties together, and they see that it expresses who I am as a person. And I think I'm having to become more confident about this idea that, well, yes, I'm always going to have a very varied stylistic base, and as I'm doing at the moment, I think the job is to pull them all together into a sort of single statement that can define my body of work and my approach to art. And I'm becoming more confident about that, even if I don't really still know what my voice is. But your voice evolves, as I say in this episode, over time anyway, and don't be afraid of that. And I don't think I'll ever be satisfied and stay in one place, and I don't really want to be. And so finding my voice is about coaxing that thread out of my body of work and sort of finding that path that runs through it and celebrating and exposing that. And that's my voice. And at some point I'm going to be able to express what that is, I hope. Finding a voice is as much about blocking other people's voices. It's as much about not listening to critics, of not judging yourself by yardsticks of culture or society, and to trust your own instincts, and to trust that your work will connect with people. And if you can do that all the while keeping your sanity, then you'll be a force to be reckoned with. But one way or another, your voice will only come when you stop shutting it down and just let it flow. Episode 16 was a bit of a frivolous addendum to episode 15. This was released on the same day. I literally walked out of the house after having recorded this and was wandering around in the woods and found myself sort of thinking about this process and sort of walking around and thinking about how I create this podcast and thinking how that relates to sort of me finding my voice and why it is the way it is. And I ramble on a bit about AI. I don't really know what my overall point here was, but it felt like I was saying something decent and I was recording it because I wanted to write it up as a script and do it as another episode, as a sort of finding my voice part 2. And when I listened back to it, I was like, well, I've actually said what I wanted to say here quite well, and the sound quality was passably decent. So I just shared it, and it's all very meta because you get a sense from this about how I conceive of these episodes and how I sort of write them and create my notes and my material to sort of rewrite. And this is also me finding a bit more confidence in my ability to just talk and to say good things. So I quite like that one. Maybe I could get a model to talk in my voice, but would it make the choices that I made? Would it, if I said to it, insert some examples in here, would it chose the examples that I chose? Because they're very much part of me, my brain, the things that I know, the knowledge that I have. On Thursday, October the 31st, I released How to Be Creative Part 2, Mo Art, Mo Problems. This is the second part of the How to Be Creative series, and it covers one of the most important aspects with regards to my philosophy of the creation of art, which is that art is fundamentally the business of solving problems. And that if you're not solving problems, you're probably not being very creative. And to be creative, you have to push yourself and you have to push your limits. Problems that you encounter, the problem of how to take this thing you see in front of you, or this idea that you have, or this emotion that you feel, and translate that into something on a canvas or on a film or on a video or as a sculpture or whatever it is you're doing. How do you do that? How do you solve the problem of instantiating that, making ideas tangible and solid in the real world? And I think that's one of the main components of what creativity is. Perhaps the most important job for an artist is connecting with other humans via their medium. Art is communication, a conversation with other humans via the shared understanding of culture. If you expose your voice in the lazy, artificial way, people will hear that lack of care and passion and turn their backs. You can't connect with the world if you don't have something compelling or at least vaguely interesting to say, and an affecting and engaging means to do that. And you can't create something compelling and engaging before having figured out the problem of having to do so. And doing so is where the good stuff is. It's the part that involves meaningful work. It's the part that involves challenge and growth. It's the part where you find mindfulness and flow. It's the part that involves a sense of fulfillment and achievement. Episode 18, Art Against Mental Politics, Art, Protest and Catharsis, November the 7th, 2024. This one was conceived of and written just as the American election was happening. So I wrote the first draft expecting to record it just before the election, didn't get round to it, and then had to sort of redraft it a bit after I discovered that Trump had won the election. Obviously, I wasn't particularly happy about this advent, as many people aren't, apart from, Vladimir Putin and Elon Musk. And sort of thinking about the function of art as a political vehicle, a vehicle of protest or catharsis or a driver for political change, and whether or not you believe you can affect the world from a political perspective with art is one thing, but the idea that art and politics aren't intrinsically linked is nonsensical, and just making art is an act of protest in itself, is an act of rebellion. Political systems and societies resist change and innovation, and as we're discovering more and more, particularly in the US, that the ability to speak freely and create freely is a gift, and it's one that should be sacrosanct as a core part of human rights, and it's increasingly becoming difficult or even dangerous to do that as despotic or fascist movements spring up all over the world. And the first thing these movements are going to do, or their leaders are going to do, is to curb self-expression, which includes creativity. And at any point, simply painting a landscape or a still life is a political act at that point. Because they don't want people thinking, they don't want people creating, they want people to be docile and compliant. And creative people tend not to be compliant. So I don't really care who you are. If you're making art, you're creating to some degree a piece of political culture. And it's worth remembering that, especially when people tell you that, oh, why are you getting involved in all this political stuff? You should just make nice things. And I would strongly advise you to push back on that. Keep doing what you do and keep fighting in the good fight. Whether your art is explicitly political or purely aesthetic, your freedom of expression to choose what to represent and how is a reinforcement of liberty and a middle finger up to tyrants. To quote German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, art is not a mirror held up to society, but a hammer with which to shape it. Next time you find some space for creativity, or when you find yourself experiencing some great art, which is basically constantly, remember this. In itself, it is an act of defiance. Defiance of the status quo and a defiance of all those who seek to perpetuate the status quo for their own malignant ends. Art is change. Be the change. Episode 19, Your Brain on Art, Part 1, Bad Homeostasis, Tuesday, November the 12th, 2024. This was part of what is currently a two-part series. Part 1, I cover my theory of bad homeostasis, which I talk a lot about neurochemicals as relates to how we operate as humans and how they dictate our mental health. And I might as well bring in episode 20 at the same time here, which is Your Brain on Art Part 2, Zen and the Art of Mental Wellness Maintenance, Monday, November the 18th, 2024. These two were basically a continuation. The first one, I sort of cover the basic principles of neuroscience. And episode 2, I finally get around to how that manifests in poor mental health, with a view to setting up an overall argument as to why creativity helps manage and improve mental health. What's interesting about this is that the first part of this is one of the most listened to episodes I've ever done. The second part of it is one of the least listened to episodes. And I don't really know what to take from that, but it's certainly not a emphatic endorsement of this. I think I probably spent too much time talking about the science and not enough time talking about the art. But this is who I am. I love science, I love technology, and I love art. I love it all, and I love it when it comes together. So I'll definitely do at least a part 3 on this. I can probably do about 12 parts on it, but I don't think that will be very popular. But I'll at least try and finish off this series because it is important to me. And I know there are people out there that do care about this stuff. So it will get finished. And yeah, screw the lot of you. I'm going to do it anyway. Only joking. I love you all. Mental illness is just like any other type of illness. It has causes and treatments. However, there's an odd and pervasive stigma around mental illness that seeks to make us believe it's all imagined, and therefore the sufferer can pull themselves together, snap out of it, or cheer up. But mental illness is never imagined, and people can't just pull themselves together any more than someone with dysentery can just get on with eating and give the toilet a break. Episode 21, Art Takes Abstract Fluidity. November the 21st, a few days later. So I've published a few of these. I'll explain what they are now because I'll probably gloss over the rest of them. Essentially, I started dictating random crap while I was doing stuff, usually walking around the Scottish countryside, but sometimes in my studio. And I've also filmed myself working and various other bits and pieces. I thought I'd share this as an experiment to see if you'd find it interesting, to see if it gave you a little bit of a window into my creative practice and maybe help people think about that practice in a much more concrete way. I've spent a lot of time over the last few months dripping ink and acrylic medium down canvases and bits of wood as an experiment on how I could create new sort of forms and textures and patterns by just letting the substances I work with do their thing. And then how can I form those into works of art, either abstract art or figurative art using sort of a background of abstraction. And I've really, really enjoyed doing that. And it's really coming together now. It's worth checking out my YouTube channel for some videos on this stuff. I'll be posting more. I found this period of experimentation a little bit daunting and jading. As much as I enjoyed actually doing it, I sort of didn't really know where I was going with it. So I've sort of taken a detour to try and expand my creative palette, as it were, and now I'm trying to merge that back into my overall body of work, and it's working really well, and I'm really, really loving what I'm doing. And it's also making me revisit a lot of old artworks and bring them back to life again. This is also in part because I've got no money and I can't really afford to buy new canvases and things, so I'm forced to go and look at what I've got and make use of that. And it's been a really creative period, and I start this new year feeling unbelievably positive about my artistic output, even if I don't quite know what I'm going to do with it. So anyway, I'll probably still keep publishing the odd art take as I record something that's worth listening to and doesn't require too much of you understanding the visual side of what I'm doing. And I hope you enjoy them. For me, they're quite fun to make, and so I'll definitely do more.
I think the other thing I've got going on here is since I don't really know how to conceive of abstract paintings, letting nature do its thing gives me hints and points directions for me into how to progress and try different things.
Right, episode 22, November the 26th, 2024, Egotist or Imposter, the misunderstood relationship between art and identity. Now, I really enjoyed making this one. I did some research on Frida Kahlo for this, which I really enjoyed, and she was such a brilliant and inspiring artist and human. I felt really pleased that I was able to talk about her in this context, and I think that she's one of the very exemplars of the concept of identity through art. And I think this is me sort of figuring out something about my own art, in that I consider this podcast part of my artistic body of work, and and I consider increasingly my identity as an important part of the work that I produce and how that's perceived. And I always sort of feel a little bit like that seems a little bit egotistical or narcissistic. This was me sort of figuring out what my view on that was. And my view on it is that you're going to put yourself into your art anyway. You only produce what you produce because you are you, and only you can do that. And therefore, as much as you might try and get out of the way of your subject and the creative muse, you're there all over it anyway, whether you like it or not. So you might as well embrace that and celebrate it. You don't have to do what Frida Kahlo did and paint lots of pictures of herself as a way to share her feelings on the world and her emotional states and her points of view. But there's no sense either in hiding yourself. It's you. This is about you. Once you sell your artwork, it's still to a degree about you. Even if other people project themselves onto it. And that's part of the beauty of art, is it's a synthesis of you and someone else, your brain and someone else's brain, your ideas and someone else's ideas. So just let it all out. In fact, your humanity and your presence in your history, your life, your reputation, your influence, the colour of your skin, your height, the tone of your voice, these are all things that send signals to other humans about you and the thing that you're conveying. And it's inescapable. You can try and change it, but there's only so far you can go with this. Your communications, your interface with the world, is your identity. Some people choose to expose and mediate that via selfies and 30-second videos. Some choose to paint a bowl of fruit that took them weeks to create. Some dance. Some write erotic fan fiction about vampires. Episode 23, Talking Therapy, Art, Policing, Cancer and Recovery with Sharon Milton. So this was the first interview episode I've done. I've got 2 published so far. This one with my good friend Sharon, who's been incredibly supportive of me, my podcast and my art ever since I met her around a year ago, I guess. She's got such an amazing story and a really inspiring story as well. And has had such a fascinating, interesting life. And it was an absolute pleasure to interview her. And I'm really privileged that she agreed to do this and to be the first person to be interviewed by me, because who knows how that was going to go. But it went really, really well. And so I'm super pleased with this one. And if you've not listened to it, I really recommend it above almost all other episodes. It's so fascinating. And Sharon will no doubt turn up again on this podcast at some point.
I was looking at the world through a very different lens when I was living with cancer, in terms of, every sunset was like looking at the last sunset. Every daffodil was like the only daffodil in the whole world. So it gave me a perspective where I really saw beauty in absolutely everything, which, was quite poignant. And for me, that period of my art was about capturing it in absolute detail and with precision.
Episode 24 was another art take. This was more of me dripping things down a canvas and talking a bit about how we should embrace natural processes, particularly things like decay, because they're quite beautiful in their own right.
This process, when it takes longer, you're sort of stretching the time frame out when you get to as you get to enjoy the various stages. And I need to remind myself that art for me is all about the process, and part of that process is just watching things happen, whether it's a portrait emerging in front of me as I paint it, or whether I've created these organic effects, letting inks or water or whatever flow across a surface. And what they're going to do and trying not to interfere with them. It's so intensely mindful.
Episode 25, Tuesday, December the 10th, 2024. Mind Your Language, Alex Against Art Speak. Now, I loved making this one. It really did go to the core of one of the reasons that I have found it difficult to break into art and to feel like I belonged here as part of the art community, because every time I read anything about art, I find it unbelievably condescending and self-important and basically unintelligible. And for a while, I thought this was a deficiency in me. I'm pretty sure I'm dyslexic, and the ADHD doesn't help. I find reading large blocks of text incredibly unpleasant and difficult and slow, and that's pretty much defines the majority of art criticism and art commentary forever. And I hate it. It's horrible. It's grotesque, and it's really alienating. And for me, art needs to be inclusive. It should be something for everyone. It should be out there so that anyone can understand it. It should be explained in plain language so that people can engage with it. I'm not saying there's no place for people writing this pseudo-intellectual drivel. And I'm sure many people love it, but I don't. And I want people out there to know that you don't have to either. It's not prerequisite. You don't have to write this bollocks about your art. You don't have to learn a whole new vocabulary just to describe a still life that you painted. And you don't have to read this crap. And I also proved that ChatGPT can write it really well. So it's not even that impressive. And I'm really sorry if you're the sort of person that writes this. The people who write this stuff clearly have a great degree of love for their art form. It's just that I don't like it. Soz. It's a book about Francis Bacon by someone called Michael Lierris. I just scanned through some of the text and found this paragraph. Noticed that this paragraph was not only in the most heinous of art speak, but is also basically one entire long sentence. I'm going to attempt to read this sentence and see how I get on with it. I'm reading directly from the book here. It's a good book, and Francis Bacon is a good artist. Let's see how well I butcher this line. Behind the glass, which according to him is a means of unifying material unevenness in the painting, by which I suspect is also intended to temper to some extent the realistic virulence of the works, or perhaps to give a certain ceremonial dignity to the presentation of the characters caught, it would seem, in more often than not, in a warm tangle of erotic exchange, or in the commonplace waking or sleeping attitudes, not to mention the grossly functional ones, or again to extend to the whole picture, including the flat background, and to finalize, thanks to an almost literally englobing that process of setting apart, of removal from the neutrality of everyday life, which is achieved as regards to certain of its features by the most diverse means. Bacon's canvases, at once so effervescent and so controlled, provide for the spectator who looks at them as a whole and grasps them in their diversity as a striking image of this unique contemporary artist in all his complexity, a complexity I had hoped markedly to reduce by studying him in the mirror of his work. Oh my God, that was one sentence. Please God help me. Episode 26 was the first half of this retrospective. And I'm sure you all found that absolutely riveting as you were finding this one. And finally, episode 27, Talking Therapy, Art, Science, Tech and Burnout with Mark Burden. I've known Mark for a long time. I really, really loved this conversation. We take different approaches to art and science and technology. We come from quite different worlds, but we're very, very similar people. And we really riff off each other when we talk. And for me, this conversation only scratched the absolute surface of the overlap of what we think and how we approach the world. And we tend to get really excitable when we talk to each other, which isn't very often. So I've resolved to do some more stuff with him in the new year. Whether or not that turns up on this podcast, or whether or not just my YouTube channel, or perhaps I'll start a new podcast or channel. But you'll be hearing more from Mark, hopefully. And I'm really, really looking forward to that because I really love talking to him.
The process of making something in whatever media is a kind of way of articulating a response and a reaction to something in life. And even the most abstractive artists will still be responding to something. It's a reaction. Art is a reaction to something.
And that brings me to the end. That's the most recent episode, apart from this one, obviously. Thank you for listening. And so where does this leave me going into 2025? Well, as I've mentioned in this episode and many earlier, the last year has been extremely challenging for me. I know there are far worse predicaments to be in than mine, which is only too obvious every time we turn on the TV or peer into the social sphere or read the news. But one way or another, I've arguably experienced the worst period of mental health of my whole life. Certainly the most extreme or profound. But I'm still here. And there are many positives. For example, I started a podcast. Hurrah! I discovered what an amazing support network I have, both family, friends, new friends, old friends. I have had so much support, and thank you all, if any of you are listening to this, and all my artistic friends, both here and down south and overseas. And I can't express enough how touching and incredible the support and help I've received is, and I don't really know how I can repay everyone, but I shall try. And obviously, my wife and kids have been incredible and put up with me. And so thank you for them. You're all beautiful and wonderful, and I love you all. And hopefully I'll have the mental capacity and energy to repay the favour to every one of you in the coming year or two. Other positives, well, I've learned a hell of a lot over the last year about myself, about podcasting, about art, about just the world in general. And I love learning, so that's been amazing. I have a permanently changed worldview. It's opening up lots of new opportunities for me to explore that I never even dreamt I would have. I didn't ever think I would be doing something like this. And hopefully all of that will help me maintain my mental health and also not to return to this fugue state that I've been in for the last 5 years, because my mental health problems didn't just suddenly spring up in winter 2024. They were really ongoing and building up to their zenith at that point. And I need to make sure I don't go back to the state that I was in before, because it really wasn't helpful. And so here's to 2025. Hopefully it'll be a little less traumatic for me than 2024. May you all have the right sort of interesting times and the best of mental health for 2025. And may you also all find endless time to be creative. As for this podcast, I have 2 more interviews in the can. Yes, 2. The first of which will be with you very shortly. Both those interviews are really, really good. Really, really inspiring. I have a long list of subject areas I'm going to cover. I'm only really just getting started with all of this stuff, and every time I let my brain run freely, I come up with a whole bunch of new things I want to cover. I've actually got a backlog of material, and I'm raring to do even more. So you're not going to get rid of me quite yet. I've also got some new episode formats that I'm going to try out, so watch this space. But otherwise, please remember to like, rate, review and share this podcast. Support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Alex Lovelace, where you can sign up for various plans that give me a little bit of pocket money to help me get by and buy new art materials. Follow me on Blue Sky, where I'm Alex Lovelace Artist. This is where I am the most vociferous and share the most. If you've got a space on your wall, go and buy some of my art on my website, alexlovelace.co.uk. That's all for now. Have a happy new year, and I'll see you soon.